So I'm here at Hicks Cemetery again, and it is a beautiful day. The sun has finally come out. It has stopped raining, and just walking around doing some exploring. And I had filmed a whole bunch of headstones when I came here before, and I did a little research preliminarily on those to put this video together. And whenever you encounter a case of suicide, it's always a very sad state of affairs, and it's usually a very sad story, sometimes even dramatic. And doing a lot of these videos on cemetery and histories of cemeteries, I don't usually encounter them that often. At best, if you look at a lot of my videos, you'll find that I am carrying maybe one story every other video at the most, you know. And what I found quite odd when I did the research on this batch of headstones is I came across 4 separate cases of suicide, all buried here at this cemetery. And some of them are very strange and peculiar. So I decided to include them all in this video. And I'm going to include them here at the beginning of the video to kind of get them out of the way. They're kind of the sad part of the video, so bear with me. There's 4 of them in a row. But some of them, well, I'll let you be the judge, but to me, some of them seem a bit suspicious. So come along and join me, and let's explore some history here at Hicks Cemetery.
We begin with the story of George Lowry. He had been a member and supporter of the Seventh-day Adventist Church for many years. He had also served as a justice of the peace in Pennfield for quite a long time. He was a farmer and considered by many who knew him to be a respected pioneer of the area. When he reached the age of 80, it appears he was experiencing dementia. This article, published in November 1885, describes him as being subject to temporary fits of insanity during which his inclination has been to end his own life. During his rational moments, he had realized his danger and asked his wife to securely lock up the razors where he could not get to them. He told her he had felt an insane desire at times to end his own life. She had secured the razors, but apparently had forgotten about his jackknife. A little past midnight, the family members living in the house were aroused by strange noises. Getting up to investigate, they found Mr. Lowry with several gashes in his own throat, rolling around in his own blood, which covered the floor of his room. They sent for a doctor, who then arrived at 1 a.m. and found that his windpipe had been severed, but none of his larger arteries. Mr. Lowry apparently was still conscious and made several attempts to lunge for the knife. He was taken to a hospital, but ultimately died from his injuries 2 days later. In an article dated November 7th, 1885, it indicated he had recently made a will and bequeathed all his property, consisting of a 40-acre farm, and all personal property to the Adventist Church. The next story is that of William Weliver. He was 40 years old, and from the news account of his death, he had also been in poor health. According to an article on his suicide, his wife was making breakfast in the kitchen, and she looked up and observed William standing in another room with a gun in his hand and a wild look in his eyes. Afraid, she ran out of the house and soon after heard the report of a gun. She hailed a stranger who was passing by and informed him of the cause of her alarm. He proceeded to the house and discovered the doors were locked, and so he broke in. He found Mr. Weliver lying on the floor with a terrible wound in his left side caused by the shot from one of the barrels of a double-barreled shotgun. The other barrel had also been set, but not fired. Mr. Weliver had been in poor health for quite some time and been described as being very despondent. It was supposed, according to an article written on November 3rd, 1893, that it was a temporary fit of insanity. The article on him did not describe much about him other than he was an estimable citizen who was regarded in the area for many years. He left a wife and no children. The story of Mary Budd is quite an interesting one. Mary Budd was born in Corunna, Ontario, in June of 1880. She came to Battle Creek with her parents as a child. She was married to Sherman Budd, and they lived in Augusta. She had gone to visit her sister in Lansing and had been staying with her for about 4 weeks She was about 60 years old. Mary had been in failing health for 18 months, and relatives said she had been also despondent because of her condition. She left her sister's home in the afternoon on Wednesday, August 30th, 1940, and went for a walk. At about 4 p.m., she walked out onto the Washington Avenue Bridge and talked for several minutes with two young boys she had encountered there. When the boys walked away, she remained on the bridge and took off her coat and laid it with her pocketbook on the bridge railing. She then leapt 30 feet into the river below. The boys, seeing her do so, told the police. Hearing the boys scream, a man who was crossing the bridge ran to the other side of the river and dove in, and he brought the woman's body to shore. The fire department had arrived on the scene with an inhalator crew and was unsuccessful in reviving her. She was survived by her husband and her son, Harry Budd. Now, it's said that Harry took the loss of his mother quite hard. Reports were that he brooded about her death in the weeks that followed. In September, he began telling his friends and his father that he intended to follow his mother within 30 days. They kind of dismissed this, and apparently no one took him seriously until he disappeared on October 2nd after he walked out of his home, but not before telling his father that he was ready to take his own life. So he went missing, the police were called, and a search party of local citizens was organized around Augusta, concentrating on the rivers in the area, assuming that that was where he was going to, quote-unquote, follow his mother. But his body was eventually found on October 10th by three boys who were searching some woods nearby. He was found laying on his right side with his knees drawn up to his chin. It was first believed that he had taken poison, but an autopsy revealed he had overdosed on sleeping pills. The coroner determined that he had died on October 2nd, just 31 days after his mother's death. It was also the day that he had gone missing. So those are the 4 suicide cases I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Not only was it the first time I'd encountered somebody on the same visit to a cemetery, but the cases also kind of impart some disturbing similarities. Lowry, Weliver, and Mrs. Budd were all described as being despondent over illness or a physical condition. And all 4 leave me with the question, perhaps from missing details in the articles, and I don't want to assume any of them were murders, but the armchair detective lingering me after watching too many crime shows on TV leaves me wondering, what are the odds that they were all in fact suicide? In any event, they're all very sad stories. So the next story is that of Jenny Krause. During the 1930s, she was active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the city of Battle Creek. She organized many local events with the WCTU, bringing in speakers to events on subjects like cigarettes are menacing to American womanhood. And she served also as the anti-narcotic director for the organization when appointed in April 1930. In October 1930, she was appointed to the WCTU committee to organize radio programs on the temperance in the area, as well as being in charge of the membership drive. She also served in many local organizations, serving as a teacher in the Loyal Workers class and a lieutenant in the Ever Ready Circle through the Maple Methodist Church. She passed away in early September 1932 and was survived by her husband and 3 daughters. She was considered to have been a very active member of the community, and the WCTU held a special vigil in her honor in the weeks following her passing. Ralph Phelps Collier enlisted in Company B of the Michigan National Guard in 1916 and served with the unit at the Mexican border. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, he was recommended for officers' training school at Fort Sheridan, and at his request, he was transferred to aviation school. He received his commission as a lieutenant as a flyer at Caulfield, Wichita Falls, Texas. He deeply regretted that he was not selected for overseas duty, but instead was retained at Love Field as an instructor. In December 1918, the airplane he was flying in went into a tailspin and he crashed. He was taken to the base hospital for his injuries, but died later on in the afternoon. His parents were wired early on a Saturday morning when they had been completing preparations for a visit to see him in Dallas. Lieutenant Collier was 24 years old, and the news of his death was a shock to the community of Battle Creek. He had enlisted when he was a member of the junior law class at the University of Michigan. He was buried with full military honors a few days later at Hicks Cemetery with a platoon of infantry and a military band from Fort Custer as the honor guard, and they escorted his casket from his parents' home to the cemetery. A detail fired the military salute over his grave, and taps was played as he was lowered into his resting place. Now we're going to take a look at the Boomhauer family. Clarence and Nettie Boomhauer moved to Battle Creek around 1911. Nettie was originally from Port Huron, and Clarence was from Flint, Michigan. They had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. Clarence ran a business which was an auto accessory dealership in the area with his son, Lou Boomhauer. Clarence would pass away in 1926 following a stroke. Now, Lou would continue on with the same business, including opening several other businesses over the years in the area. He had a radio supply company and later would open up the Silver Slipper Roadhouse, which we'll get into more here in a bit. Both Lou and his brother Don were accomplished musicians. Lou played violin and he was part of the orchestra at the Bijou Theater. He later became a director of the orchestra at that theater and then left to run his own orchestra. His orchestra would later play at the Silver Slipper Roadhouse as well. Don Boomhauer played in his own orchestra and frequently played for the Elks, Masons, Knights of Columbus, the Chamber of Commerce parties, and also the Battle Creek Sanitarium. At one time, he had the pit orchestra at the Post Theater. The other brother, Leo, would move back to Flint, Michigan, and his sister Amber would remain in the Battle Creek area, and the other sister, Catherine, would marry and move to Flint, Michigan. In June of 1927, during Prohibition, Lou's Silver Slipper Roadhouse, which was considered to be a pretentious establishment, was raided. The police officers in charge conducted one of the most sensational raids in the city's history, interrupting diners and dancers as part of their local cleanup campaign. The story was headlines in the weeks that followed in the city of Battle Creek. Led by the under-sheriff, Colby, the raiding party swarmed into the roadhouse shortly after 10 o'clock. Diners who were in formal dress gasped as they informed Mr. Boomhauer that they had come to search the place for liquor. Lou turned his keys over to the deputies and told them that they were welcome to search all parts of the building, including the safe, but he then volunteered, "Hey, I have a few bottles of beer in the icebox for my own use, and the alcoholic content in them is quite doubtful." So the officers searched the entire building, looking in every nook and cranny, including the outbuildings, and found nothing else. They found the bottles of beer that he had said that were there in his fridge, and there wasn't that many of them. The officers were hesitant to arrest Boomhauer and his partner, but after conferring with the judge, they were placed under arrest. The story goes on that they were both given $1,000 bonds, and Boomhauer declared to the press the next day, "Despite the opinions of those who have never visited the Silver Slipper, I have never served beer or whiskey in the building, and I've tried to operate a respectable place and will continue to do so." So that was his statement to the press. Now, the battle went on in the court for several months, and Judge North, whom I featured in my Oak Hill videos, if you want to check those out, he was a famous judge in the area. He even presided over the Kellogg brothers in their suit between each other. So Lou was ultimately fined in Judge North's court, given a fine of $300 and a sentence to serve 30 days in jail for illegal possession of liquor. So during the same time, his wife would file for divorce, and he again was before Judge North several times that same year over that matter. So Lou would return to operate the Silver Slipper, but later sell the business. He then purchased a business called the Pollyanna, which was located on Calhoun Street. It was a tea room and a sandwich shop. And over the years, he still played in his orchestra, and he also taught violin lessons in the community. He would teach his own daughter, Virginia Boomhauer, to play, and she, in 1928, played live on the radio. So Lou would pass away in 1933. Don Boomhauer, in 1928, moved to Indianapolis, and he attended Lincoln College and also directed the theater orchestra there. While in Indianapolis, he met Red Skelton Carlton, who was then new into show business, and he and his wife became close friends with Don and his wife. Don would later move to Washington, D.C. and establish a medical equipment business where he would run that successfully for many years. And in 1948, he sold the business and moved to Sarasota, and he remained there until he passed away in 1968. So that's kind of the story of the Boomhauers. So let's next look at John and Iva Grindal. John and Iva would marry in 1923, and they would have 4 daughters. Iva was giving birth to her 5th child, a boy, in 1936 when she died from complications during childbirth. What was interesting about these two is that Iva, prior to her death, worked at Kellogg's, and John worked at Post. In the years following Iva's death, John would raise his daughters and remarry in 1944 to Martha Brunker. One of his daughters, Janice, would graduate from University of Michigan and enlist in 1942 in the Army as a nurse during World War II and become a lieutenant stationed in England. She would write letters home, and John would have them published in the local newspaper, which was common during that time for people to do so to share life overseas with the others in the community. She would meet Lieutenant Stanley Collier in the Army Engineers Unit while in England, and they would get married there. John would retire from Post in 1955 after 27 years and spend his retirement traveling with Martha. He eventually passed away in 1966 at the age of 75. So at Hicks Cemetery, there's a large family plot for the Morse family. There's several stories to be told there, as many of the members served the nation in the military and were quite active in the Battle Creek community. However, in this video, I'm going to focus on one story of Edward Charles Morse. I'll probably also touch on a few of the other stories briefly. Edward Charles Bud Morse was born in Battle Creek on August 25th, 1919. He was a member of the First Baptist Church and also a Boy Scout. He graduated from Battle Creek Central High School in June of 1939. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy in August of 1940 and trained at Great Lakes Naval Training Station. He returned home for 2 weeks following his basic training and then started his duty in Bremerton, Washington, aboard the USS Arizona. He had been in service on that vessel less than a year when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Following Pearl Harbor, his family was eventually notified that he was missing in action about 2 weeks later. They were not informed as to what ship he was serving on or much about the circumstances of his MIA status at the time. In fact, his death was not officially confirmed until January 31st, 1942, when they were told that he was killed at Pearl Harbor during the strike on the USS Arizona. They received a letter that stated, "After exhaustive search, it has been found impossible to locate your son, Edward Charles Morse, Seaman First Class, USN. And he, therefore, has been officially declared to have lost his life in the service to his country as of December 7th, 1941. The Navy Department expresses to you its sincerest sympathy." So there's a headstone marker for Edward at Hicks Cemetery in the family plot, but likely his remains are still entombed with all the other sailors of the USS Arizona Memorial in Hawaii. He was 22 years old. His father, Edward J. Morse, was working as the county clerk during the time that he was notified of his son's death. He had served in World War I, and in August of 1942, he was also called into service with the U.S. Navy and served again in World War II. Another member of the Morse family, Howard Edward Morse, would become a corporal with the United States Marine Corps and serve as a helicopter crew chief in Vietnam. He was killed in the line of duty at just 20 years of age and was presented with the Air Medal with Gold Stars, the Purple Heart, Military Merit, and the Cross of Gallantry with palms.
Well, that's going to conclude today's journey through history here at Hicks Cemetery. If you liked today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button down there and be sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to listen to podcasts, check out my podcast at Tales of Southwest Michigan's Past. I carry a lot of local and Southwest Michigan history stories that I don't always get a chance to put into video form. So until next time, thanks for watching.